My name is Laksh. I'm also part of the San Francisco Berniecrats. I coordinate our housing committee, and I was the co-author for the San Francisco Community Housing Act, which was a bill that we tried to pass through the ballot back in 2018 before we suspended our signature gathering campaign. So just wanted to go over what that's about, what is universal social housing, sort of the title of the talk, and why exactly did we come up with this specific bill. So anybody who lives in San Francisco probably knows, the housing crisis in the city. There's a lot of income and wealth inequality in the city. There's basically the working class has felt the squeeze more than any other group, but there's been a complete annihilation of community, displacement, increased stress and health because of being forced to displace and leave the city of San Francisco because of unaffordability. Longer commutes. A lot of folks have been gentrified out of San Francisco into the East Bay. That's not good for the environment. Even if you take part of public transit, it still has an impact. And large developers are really the ones who are making the biggest profits. And there's a statistic I found from the National Apartment Association, which is that the net operating incomes are close to about $18 a square foot on an apartment in San Francisco. That's revenue minus your expenses. So we're talking about a huge amount of money that's being made by developers in the city. At the same time, about 71% of renters making less than $75,000 are rent burdened, and that means that they pay over 30% of their income is typically the threshold you use. They pay over that much in terms of their rent. And there's a lot of reasons why it's happened. There's been the Twitter tax break. There's been a complete lack of regulation. Federal public housing, and I'll talk about this I'll show a graphic with this as well. It's completely been slashed, especially since the 1980s, going into the 1990s. And a lot of that defunding has been linked with racism and classism in terms of the United States and its housing policies for home ownership specifically. Redlining, for example, created de facto segregation, which led to a lack of investment in public housing as one of the main factors. All of SS public housing has now been privatized, and this lack of funding overall has just been correlated with significant increases in homelessness, as I'm sure many of you are aware. State housing has also dropped in terms of investment. Redevelopment agencies have had a lot of issues, but were finally killed off in early 2011 or so. And private investment is basically what's been picking up the slack over these past few decades, especially since the federal government got out of the way. There's a real lack of supply of affordable housing as well in the city, and I appreciated seeing this in the platform as well. You can define affordable housing in all kinds of ways. You can define it so that somebody making 150% of the median income counts as affordable, although it doesn't make sense. And by affordable, I'm talking more about like 30% of median income, 50% of median income. There's also a significantly high cost of land in urban areas, and it's only going to go up and up, especially during a housing boom. And an ecosystem built around that, the whole financialization of the real estate industry that is expecting return on investments from banks to developers, to investors. On top of all this, the tenants are really powerless. They don't have any means of organizing against large rent increases. Even when there is rent control, there's no vacancy control. As some of you might know, as part of the effort to repeal Costa-Hawkins. So I wanted to just show this little graph. It might be a little bit hard to see, but there's this green line over here that's federal public housing investment from HUD, and you can see it sort of just sharply drops in the 1980s, and then it's completely killed off under Bill Clinton, and that started happening under Reagan especially. Nixon started pushing it along as well, and it's just been a massive project, both from the right wing and from neoliberals like Bill Clinton to defund public housing in the United States. So, this leads to a lot of questions about how should housing work. It should guarantee a secure shelter that's for not-for-profit. If you work in San Francisco, ideally you should be able to live in San Francisco. It should foster community input. It should provide accessible amenities without, sort of creating housing that's completely isolated from a lot of services that folks might need, like childcare. And there shouldn't be any amount of profit motive that's causing eviction. Another aspect that we sort of thought of when we were coming up with this is having unionized public sector employees maintaining the housing, especially in the light of the Supreme Court Janus decision, which is making it difficult for public sector unionization to continue. There needs to be an increased focus on the public sector, and one of the real last bastions of unionization that remains in American society. So the culmination of all of that was the San Francisco Community Housing Act, and we wrote this measure, as I said, we released it for the ballot last year, and we've just been reworking it since then. So a couple of things have changed about it. The main thing is that it's a measure that funds the acquisition, building, or rehab of housing that is going to be perpetually publicly owned. So what that means is it's total decommodification. The land that's bought with this measure, or that's built on with this measure, would remain in the public trust. It wouldn't be sold to any corporations over time. There's a goal in the legislation, which is 1,500 units every 3 years, either acquired or built. So initially, in the first few phases, it's a lot quicker to acquire. A lot of this will be focused on acquisition. And they would be equally distributed across the supervisorial districts, so it's not focused in maybe District 6, which you might know is south of Market, and Treasure Island. A lot of the development recently has been focused there. There would also be community councils in the legislation that basically provide oversight over for tenants to have some control over what's happening in their day-to-day lives and advocate for improvements. And amenities and rapid public transit are part of the legislation as well, funding for childcare centers and improved public transit provided. So who can be a tenant in this program? We changed this around since the last time, and it's basically a very universal program now. Anyone who lives or works in San Francisco can qualify. And there's a definition of works, and there's also housing uses, which is typically you spend 75% of your working hours in San Francisco. That's also the case for a lot of other affordable housing programs in the city. And the other thing is, you have to sell any property if you're accepted. If you're renting in another place, you have to vacate it. You can't sublet at the same time. You can't Airbnb your units at the same time. So there's no money making off of this measure. And there's a lottery to fill vacant units based on an income distribution. So there's a citywide income distribution in the legislation that it aims for. So let me just actually show that on this slide over here. So this is sort of the main reason why I made a presentation. It's a split of different income distributions. You can see 0 to 30% of the median income that's in the platform, as well as like the extremely low income bracket. There's a low income, 30 to 50% of median income. Folks who might be dishwashers, making minimum wage puts you in around that bracket. 50 to 80% of the median income has another 20% of units, 80 to 120%, and then above 120% of the median income, that last bracket is also included there. But you can sort of see the income distribution is focused largely on folks who are low income, moderate income in San Francisco. And there are some folks at the higher income ends that sort of help keep the rents able to cover operating costs. That way we can also make sure that the rent is sort of affordable for lower income folks who are paying, because there are higher income folks paying sort of solidarity rents. And the rent, I sort of forgot to mention, is generally about it's capped at 25% of your household income. It was actually the definition that public housing started at before it started to get raised to 30, and then went from there. And this is sort of a cap, so obviously it could be lower, but there is a minimum rent. It ends up being about $300 a month. It's based on a half-time minimum wage worker and what a quarter of their income would be, their total income would be. And, part of what this allows for is it allows for a stable, some sort of stability with where your rent is going to go. Your income, if your income suddenly declines, you can apply for a hardship exemption in the legislation. But generally, your income will be assessed every 2 years, so you have an idea about when you might be in for a new rent. And it'll always be affordable within your means. There's also a unit size qualification, and part of this is based around the idea that you shouldn't have overcrowding. You should have a unit size that meets your household needs, and so we have these minimum unit requirements in the legislation based on your household size. If you have, say, 2 people, it would be a 1-bedroom, 3 people, 2-bedroom, and so on. So it's sort of based on the theme that the housing is based on your need rather than your ability to pay. And just had some more example cases here. We can go through these or skip them, but you can see the maximum rent for all these different theoretical households, like the three-person household making $28,000 as a minimum wage, single minimum wage worker with 2 kids would pay about $600 a month in rent for a 2-bedroom, which is almost unheard of in the city. Going all the way up to if you're making close to $160,000 as one person, your maximum rent would be about $3,000, which, if you believe it or not, is still lower than the rent of some studios in the city. That's how bad it's gotten. There's also some other aspects of the legislation, if there's time to talk about it. Part of the legislation is the city buying up units of housing. You might wonder what happens if I'm a tenant, the city buys up my housing. What's in the legislation right now is that the tenants get to actually vote on the decision. They get to have feedback sessions with the city where they get to hear about what the acquisition will look like, how would it affect their rent. And during the whole process, if there's ever any rehab, or if you're, even after the city buys it, if you have to leave the building just for it to be brought up to code or something, there are a lot of protections in place, like making sure to cover your moving costs, your changes in rent, providing a stipend, giving you a right to counsel. So there are a lot of tenant protections in the legislation as well, because you have to be mindful whenever you're changing a lot of the real estate landscape in the city. It's going to cause a lot of transition, and in that time of transition, you don't want that burden to fall on the folks who are the most vulnerable. So there are protections in the legislation for compensation and stipends for that reason as well. And the last part is community councils. So these are the independent associations of tenants. They're elected by tenants, and they play a role in overseeing improvements, having their political voice heard. They can meet with their supervisor. I think it's twice a year. They can compel meetings and advocate for improvements more generally. And they may oversee evictions as well if there's ever a case that happens where the city might be overstepping its boundaries. This is sort of a check on that from the tenants' end. And yeah, that's about it in terms of the measure. There's also amenities, as I mentioned, rapid public transit. During commute periods, it would run every 10 minutes, which is slightly watered down version of our previous legislation, but probably more in the means of SFMTA right now to fund public transit every 10 minutes during commutes. In addition to that, there would be full-day public childcare within about a quarter-mile radius or so of these public housing complexes, and 2 public restrooms and community meeting spaces. Community meeting spaces are something we saw in a lot of public housing abroad. There's often this feeling, this special feeling of community, of events that communities hold together, and so on. So this is partly for that, and also for the community councils of tenants to meet. We had some ideas about funding. Last time we ran this measure, it was a parcel tax on square footage. But that's definitely not something that we're tied to right now. We're looking at more general corporate taxes on the wealthy. You might remember November's Proposition C was a corporate tax on the corporations making over 50 million. Why can't the corporations making over 25 million pay tax as well? I'm sure they're doing fine. June's Prop G was another idea. It was a parcel tax, but that was a flat parcel tax by the SF Unified School District. That one doesn't scale with square footage. It was one of the things that we weren't as fond about because essentially what can end up happening is a giant parcel, like a skyscraper that's registered as one parcel, can end up paying the same amount of tax as a single family home. So these are just some ideas that we had, and right now we're leaning towards a tax on corporations. I'm just going to end it right there.